Yogi Schultz, good to talk to you again.
Well, glad to be back, Dan, for another podcast. I think we can make this interesting and appealing to your audience.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've been reading your articles that you referred to me on PMI World, and I'll put a link to that when we publish this podcast as well, so that listeners can check those out. The one that jumped out at me was how to tell a Gantt chart jockey from a real project manager. Gantt chart jockey, reminds us of desk jockey. And reading that article, it really brought to mind the question of governance, because to me, a Gantt chart means governance. Coming from a delivery and hands-on implementation background, Gantt charts aren't something that I would naturally have done, but becoming a project manager, that's something you need to get familiar with. And it goes hand in hand with planning, then governance, all the documentation that goes with a well-run project. But it sounds like from the very title, we can't go overboard with that. It can't be the be-all and end-all. Can you just maybe summarize your overall thoughts? And there are two parts to the article for listeners.
Yeah.
Your overall thesis.
Sure. I think you've hit it correctly, Dan. A project manager who focuses solely on the Gantt chart and manages it and revises it and updates it on a daily basis, and that's his only focus, is doing only part of the job and is going to be unsuccessful. You're right to point out that the Gantt chart is a component of governance, and I'm not anti-Gantt chart by no means. I'm critical of those project managers who focus their entire life on their Gantt chart and fail to perform the other aspects of a reasonable project manager's position. So maybe we should talk about that. So, for example, think about project integration management. A Gantt chart jockey uses a brief high-level project statement and maybe throws into that a few feel-good themes. And a short project plan illustrates the approximate elapsed time for a planned project. But if you don't elaborate on that, you're going to be unsuccessful. A more experienced project manager will first develop a project charter or lead the development of that, and then a more detailed project plan that focuses on the effort required to produce deliverables and is updated regularly. A Gantt chart jockey probably doesn't do any of that.
I remember in the book Scrum, by Jeff Sutherland, he says that how many projects actually adhere to their Gantt chart? 0. But Gantt charts still have a place, would you say?
Yeah, so I agree with the statement that projects rarely adhere to their Gantt chart at the very detailed level, because that's impossible, because there's a significant error term in every estimate for every task. However, the Gantt chart does describe the overall intent of the project and hopefully has all or as many of the tasks that you know about and explicitly described. And as you build a Gantt chart, you will discover all the project tasks that you forgot about or didn't consider that pop into your mind as you're building the Gantt chart, either individually at your desk or as a team in a meeting room with a million stickies or a giant whiteboard. Both exercises are very important and very valuable. So to discount the value of the Gantt chart because it's not adhered to in detail, I think is wrong. It's an error, misleading.
So, relating back to our previous podcast, and, one of your expertises is in project sponsorship. As a project manager, not even program manager, but project manager, or even someone in the team, our perception is that these kinds of artifacts are what the project sponsor really values, because that's how they understand, that's how they can get an understanding of what's happening in the project. They don't usually, a project sponsor is usually too senior to have the time to walk the floor and talk to the team members and really understand what's going on. And that's not their job. They rely on these artifacts. So, that's something that a project manager has to bear in mind, don't they? That these artifacts are also a communication method.
Absolutely. So the project sponsor should have an interest in a rolled up version of the Gantt chart. Now, if he or she doesn't have that, then it's the project manager's job to be a little assertive about that, and, if you might, force a little meeting to review a high-level Gantt chart. Project sponsors and other stakeholders, the number one interest is the completion date. They don't care so much about what has to happen from today to get to that completion date, and they tend to judge projects mostly on the variance between what the Gantt chart said about the completion date and the reality that on the date at which the project delivers. So what the result of that dynamic is that a very detailed Gantt chart allows the project to defend their planned completion date, because nobody likes the planned completion date. They all want it months or even years before that. And the only way the project team can avoid being beaten up by their stakeholders over an undesirable but probably realistic completion date is to say, okay, please schedule some time and help us go through the detailed project Gantt chart if you're not happy, and you can tell us and help us understand the tasks that we have that you think are either unnecessary or out of scope. Now, if you hold that meeting with stakeholders, always the opposite happens. The stakeholders come to realize that there are tasks missing that are added during the course of this meeting, and that the effort or elapsed time or both of some tasks is too low, not too high. Now what happens is the stakeholders start to help you defend the project plan that was initially received as Looney Tunes and padded and ridiculously gold-plated. Everyone starts to build a commitment to that project plan because they now understand it. So that's one of the values of a Gantt chart.
Right. On the question of what's included in it, so to talk about completion date, we need to know what we're completing. I'm involved in two projects right now, which are both technology, and with technology, especially today, with so many new tools available, so many new data sources available and ways of analyzing data, there's so much potential to change the scope, expand the scope, add new things, and it's a good thing. There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, but when you're halfway through a project and people are talking about adding new things or considering, completely new deliverables, what does that? Well, who am I speaking from the perspective of? I guess the project manager, not the project sponsor. How do we handle a situation like that? There are a lot of people who are facing this today, I would say.
Every day people face that, Dan. What happens as the team is intellectually engaged in the project, they will think of all kinds of new functionality and new data sources, which is what you talked about, that will genuinely add value to the project. So the project manager needs to be a bit of a tyrant at that moment in time, because the effect of adding functionality, adding data sources, that's all new scope. And that new scope guarantees that the delivery will be later than the planned completion date or the agreed completion date with the steering committee. So my approach to this problem is always to say, thank you for bringing up that idea. Here's our scope change request form. please complete it because I like the idea that you're presenting to me. And then when that form is completed, I review it and stick it into a file folder or a directory or someplace and ignore it. Okay. Now, it doesn't take long for the team to figure out that I'm ignoring them all. And the response is, you're asking me to fill out these forms, but we're not doing anything with them. So why are you having me do that? I'm feeling slighted or ignored or, sandbagged, not a happy scene. And I say to them, very honestly, I say, I appreciate all these forms. They're really important because months from now or a year from now, we will forget these good ideas if we don't write them down. However, I'm committed to meeting our end date, and acting on these proposed changes guarantees that we won't. So we will lose all credibility within the organization if we don't meet our end date. So then they say, okay, that makes sense. Why bother filling out the forms then? Well, the reason is if we meet our end date, the organization will give us another pile of money to build on what we've already completed, and we have a lot of credibility with the organization because we have met our end date. So now we will charter a new project and take all the forms that you've diligently filled out, which I appreciate, and that will become the basis of the next project. So it has value, just not today.
Right. So we have all seen projects, and I'm seeing them now, where the end date is not met and it's extended and extended and extended. Partly because of scope creep, partly for other reasons. And credibility is the big thing, isn't it? There,
right.
You do lose it.
Rightly or wrongly, the team loses credibility with the organization when they slide by end dates. That may not be their fault. They may have pushed hard to avoid that. Whatever it is, the team receives the blame for sliding by the end date, rightly or wrongly.
Is it possible that, okay, you met the end date, but what did you deliver? This bare bones thing. The point is, that's what we promised. That's what we agreed to.
Well, okay, there may be a few people who actually notice that in order to meet the end date, that the scope was reduced. Okay. And in fact, in a severe case, you don't have enough to go into production. But you now understand the space in ways you never did at the beginning of your work.
Yeah.
So, that's one of the consequences of this approach.
Yeah.
You're obviously a smart and experienced guy, Dan, if you immediately figured out the consequence of this approach.
And another way that people handle it is phasing. At least we can deliver the first phase on time, but it's greatly reduced, and then the rest of the scope can be in another phase and another phase, and that's how the project.
Yeah, so absolutely that happens, Dan, and that can be a very good strategy. Now, in the Yogi Schultz universe, the word phase and the word release are quite different. Mm-hmm. And I work very hard to have people understand the difference. So phases are the names of the grouped activities like design, test, build, within a release. And a release is something that's promoted to production. Right. So the way you are using phases is the common way to do it, but I label that as a release.
Yep.
So.
Yep. No, I understand. Yes. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, unfortunately, but yes, no. Point taken.
Yeah. So I'm really big on clarity of communication as a way to win. And whenever you fuzz it up, people make too many assumptions in all innocence out of desperation, and they lead you into big trouble. So communication is a huge component of governance in my mind, or clarity of communication.
Yeah. That just reminds me of something we're facing now. that I'm seeing, about communication, where one part of the organization is eagerly waiting for this project to deliver, but the project is sliding on through different releases. It's separated out into different releases, which wasn't originally meant to be the case, but that's been a way of at least getting something out. But the delivery, well, the project team, is not the communication with the business that's waiting for these deliverables it's not really there. I mean, artifacts are available, but the business won't look at them. It's not that they won't, maybe they can't find them, they've lost the link, there's no regular cadence of meetings, and the meetings can be a bit strained as well, because we want to know the dates, but the project can't give them the dates because they're not settled yet, and they just don't know. There are all these technical problems that they're encountering. Obviously it's better to just be upfront and say, look, we don't know. Your deliverable that you're expecting to get in 3 months, it could actually be a year away, but nobody wants to say that. Any points on?
Yeah. So you're describing multiple situations there, Dan. Right. One is the team is not communicating. That's not often the case. Another is the way the documents are organized, nobody can find anything. Okay. And the third one is the most common in my mind, is the way the team is communicating doesn't align with the way the organization can absorb the information. And often that means that the team is putting on too much detail or a technical bend. So you need less detail and more business impact of whatever you're reporting in the way of status or issues or forecast. So, you talk about the stakeholder group that's eagerly awaiting. Yeah, hopefully that's the case, because that means you're pursuing something that's of value and relevance to some stakeholder community. The question I would ask, to what extent is a group that's eagerly awaiting the result contributing to accelerating the delivery of the result, or worse, impeding the delivery of the result by failing to answer questions for issues, or failing to provide resources for testing, or failing to respond to prototypes, all of those kinds of interactions that a team needs to be successful.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I think this comes down to the way team's performance is measured, because a team that has the resources to help with a project, they're actually not measured on that. They're measured on their day-to-day deliverables.
Correct.
The project is something sort of in the background that will help them with their day-to-day deliverables when the project eventually delivers. So they're not, they want the outcome, but their KPIs don't motivate them to really help as much as they could.
Yeah. So
as much as they'd like to.
Yeah. And the business, by definition, is trying to run the business. So they're in crisis response mode more often than they care to admit, to keep the business running. So the minute you have a crisis in the business, the priority to fulfill your responsibilities or what you've agreed to do for the project just disappears off the radar screen. And this can have a horrible impact on the schedule of the project. And the project manager has to have a certain amount of sophistication to explain that at the next steering committee without insulting the vice president. And many project managers fail to do that. And then they wonder why at the end, nobody likes them, or they get fired, or not promoted, or sidelined.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you're encountering these issues on your current projects in spades. You talk when, I've managed a number of data analytics projects, and the first prototype of the data visualization, that's one of the key deliverables of the project, always looks horrible. It's yuck. What is your team doing? Why are we spending money on your team if this is the deliverable? And when you analyze that problem, it's always data quality. And then the price to fix the data quality is always gargantuan and very scary. And while it isn't the project team's fault per se, it's often perceived, they're often blamed for it because they're the ones who pointed it out.
Right. Yeah, no, data quality is a major thing. I just wanted to pick up on a point you mentioned earlier about the project manager has to have the sophistication to deliver the message, I guess, to the steerco.
Difficult message.
Difficult message. It also matters who's on the steerco, doesn't it? Because if the steerco doesn't have, is it sufficiently senior people in general, then no amount of good communication to the steerco might be able to solve the problem.
That's right. So a steering committee, if some vice president has delegated participation to a director who's delegated it to a manager who's delegated to a newbie manager, that steering committee will fail to help the project team. Mm-hmm. So because they just either don't have the understanding or they don't have the internal power to actually help the project manager and the project team. Mm-hmm. So that it has to be high enough. The participation of the stakeholder committee has to be high enough that the people there can actually influence allocation of resources or respond to high level problems or recommendations that the team is making. And if the member of the steering committee says, okay, I understand the issue you're raising, I agree with your recommendation, but I can't give you an answer. I need to consult with A, B, or C, and we'll get back to you. That's a red flag that tells you you've got the wrong people in the steering committee meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. As we're talking about this, it strikes me that none of this is really related to delivery, is it? And I think looking at your Gantt chart jockey article, I think what it's really saying is that a Gantt chart jockey, you're not saying governance isn't important. It seems it's more about shallowness, isn't it? When I read those bullet points, yeah, that's right. It's kind of a shallow approach.
Yeah, just very superficial, shallow, inadequate. So, for example, we talked about scope management earlier. The Gantt chart jockey views scope enlarging opportunities as a way to increase the project's importance by claiming to deliver more value by asking for more money, increasing the project size as scope is added. That's kind of a self-aggrandizing approach to project management, but that's going to lead to a project that fails and collapses by taking that approach to scope management. And similarly on cost management, the article is framed around the major topics in PM BOK in the hopes of improving the communication among project managers. So a Gantt chart jockey tends to create a project budget with very few line items and estimated costs based largely on the planned number of elapsed months shown in the original project schedule. That's a recipe for disaster, because you should never base anything on elapsed time. Everything should be based on effort.
Right. Yep.
So,
especially with matrix teams and people are rarely 100% on a project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's another thing. And, I have a lot of ideas, and one of them is maybe unrealistic too. To me, people are either 100% on the project, 50% on the project, or zero. Anybody whose planned effort allocation is somewhere between 0 and 50% makes no discernible net contribution to the project, because they spend more time bringing themselves up to speed on what they need to do next. in the third or the quarter of whatever time they've been allocated to the project, and they never make a net contribution. So if someone can't be committed to at least half time, I say, fine, we're not assigning any tasks to you, but if you have time to review deliverables and make comments, we would be happy to have you contribute in that way. And some people say yes to that, and some people are insulted. And if the reaction to that is insulted, then okay, sorry, then please go away. We will scratch you off the team roster and you're done.
So if someone's not 50% or 100%, then it could be just ad hoc contributions. So they're not officially on it one day a week, because one day a week doesn't make sense. It's just
right.
we've got a draft business requirements doc. Could you review that?
Right. And if they respond, wonderful. And if they don't, they're not the critical path. We're not looking for their sign off. We don't care.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And maybe that has quality implications. And if their boss complains about that, I'm happy to say, well, we're keen to have that person's contribution, but they didn't give it. So if you can turn that around, we would be pleased to hear from that person.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's excellent. Speaking of quality, so let's turn to our second topic, which is offshoring. So there's a whole range of experiences that I've seen that people have with offshoring, and often there are fantastically hardworking and capable people in offshore teams. And in one of my roles several jobs ago, there was a whole analytics center set up offshore that would do data science, end-to-end development, everything. And they had a lot of status equal to the main company, or people at the main company, and very productive, a lot of innovation. I think the stereotype, I guess, or even just the more common use of offshore is with more process-oriented work, like obviously call centers, but processing claims, some kinds of testing. I think it's important to carefully manage an offshore team in order to get value, because I mean, even when you're in the same room, we can misunderstand each other. When people are in a different country, in a different culture, obviously the chances of misunderstanding increase exponentially. Would you just have some points, and you've written a great article about it, on what to bear in mind when a company is, let's focus on when we're already offshoring, because often the decision's already made. Often people in projects don't really have a say in it. It's already decided. So we need to work with it and make the best out of the overall decisions that have been made.
Well, sure, Dan. You've introduced some of the themes and the issues already in your opening remarks there. And, the example of that analytics center is if they have a defined set of data sources that they're working with, and there's adequate data quality in there, then they can do an excellent job as technicians and software developers and data visualization developers to produce products that are truly impressive and valuable and worthwhile and all of those good things. However, and by the way, in that scenario, what you're doing is you're outsourcing a one-liner or a very short description of the product that you want, and the people at the other end can work with that and deliver something good to you. However, in custom software developers, there's an enormous amount of back and forth between the onshore project team and the offshore project team, and then all the issues that you hinted at, like language, culture, communication, time zones, all interfere with the ability to be productive and stay on track and stay on quality. So I think the nature of the project and the nature of the function that you're trying to outsource is a really big deal. So you mentioned help desk. Yup. data center operations, network security monitoring, application operation, website operation, IT administration. Those are all great examples of something you can offshore and have a success. And I think the way I would tend to define a success is you're getting a quality result and you're getting a significant cost benefit, meaning your operating cost benefit. But there are other IT functions that are not suitable for offshoring, and people somehow attempt that sometime. Strategy development, collaboration to achieve some kind of a consensus building on requirements, computing infrastructure build and upgrade, people change management. You can't do that offshore. Software package implementation, technology evaluation, those are all IT functions that are not suitable for offshoring. And when you try those functions, no matter how brilliant the vendor is or how determined or helpful or well-staffed they are, you will still fail. So that's number one. So if something that's inappropriate is being outsourced, and again, as you pointed out, you're not being asked about the decision of whether it was being outsourced or not. You're just being told to deliver. If you're being handed something that's inappropriate for offshoring, then you better put your hand up, because there's no point you becoming associated with something that's unsuccessful.
Right.
Go
on. Sorry.
You talked about some of the issues. You talked about the language differences and the cultural differences. Think about India. Hundreds of millions of people in India speak English. So you think, we're not going to have a problem with language. No, you're wrong. You will have a problem with language, because their accent is different, their vocabulary is different, their understanding of your organization's culture is minimal, and there may be English flowing back and forth in your Zoom meeting or your Teams meeting or whatever, but that doesn't mean there's understanding flowing back and forth. You mentioned the difficulty of achieving a consensus or achieving understanding when everybody's sitting in the same room in the same building. Well, these other issues will get in the way on offshoring.
It's hard to believe that people change management would ever be considered to be offshored. That's such a soft, human, not that it's human, but, there's so many subtleties with the communication involved in that.
So fair enough for challenging that. Maybe that doesn't even deserve to be on the list.
Oh, well, you must have seen
I was just trying to be reasonably comprehensive.
Right.
I agree with you. Hopefully nobody is naive or stupid or inexperienced enough to try that. Because you can't very well deliver change management through Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You might want to, somebody might think that you can deliver change management through remote desktop, but I'm skeptical.
So if someone's in a project and there is offshoring going on, and it's okay, but we'd like to have more onshore, and it might even be, okay, we're happy to have a smaller team, but we'd rather have people onshore, so maybe there wouldn't be that much of a cost difference anyway. It might actually be a decision for the project sponsor, or certainly it's something the project manager would need the project sponsor to push for them, to try to get approval for that. If it's against the company's policies, or if it requires an exception to the policies, you need the project sponsor to help you. The project manager would need to somehow make their case, wouldn't they, to the project sponsor?
Yeah, to either offshore when nobody wants that, or to not offshore when everybody wants that. And I think what the article about to offshore or not to offshore says, here are the issues that you need to address. The list of them in your pitch. And if you can't do that, maybe you shouldn't be pushing back against the policy the organization has in place. You've got to show some overriding benefit to override the agreed policy within the organization. So there are great examples of offshoring that works really well. So for example, in the last few decades, as major organizations have made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in their e-commerce presence. Here in Canada, some large multi-billion dollar publicly traded organization, their e-commerce presence is run by offshoring teams in Europe, in the Ukraine, in Romania, and that's been seen as a huge success. The people are technically capable and competent and experienced, like you've alluded to. The two organizations have figured out how to work together through a number of years of determination and trust, and a few fiascos that papered over, but nonetheless, they've stuck to it, and they have a genuine benefit. At the technical level, at the availability level, at the build out of functionality level, whatever level you want. So there are success stories. So this is not an anti-offshoring kind of article. One of the issues that you get with the offshoring vendor is high turnover of their staff. If they're paying their staff poorly or even exploiting them, those people are going to do their best to leverage whatever experience they're gaining at their current position to get out of there and move somewhere else. So I'm aware of situations where you have 200, 300, 400% turnover of your lower level staff in the offshore vendor organization. Well, that's a killer for progress. All you're doing there is spending the whole year reorienting people to the substance of the project they're working on.
In an argument for or against offshoring in a project context, you mentioned earlier that really a project is all about the end date, delivering the agreed scope by the end date. So any argument about offshoring should come back to the end date. Would that be right?
I think so. And the way you're going to achieve the end date, you have to have a certain level of quality, a certain level of scope. And if you're reworking deliverables 2, 3, 4 times because of cultural misunderstandings between you and the staff of the outsourcer, you're not going to make, I shouldn't say outsourcer, offshore, well, maybe it is an outsourcer, offshore outsourcer, you're never going to make the end date. So if you look at this list of issues that add risk to offshoring, they're all fairly soft kinds of issues. There's nothing there about technology. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'm sitting in India or in Los Angeles, I have access to Oracle or Python or Microsoft Power BI, whatever the tool is. It doesn't tend to be about the tools or the technology. People have access to that on a global basis and have a certain proficiency with them as well.
Yeah. I'm doing a side project, and I was getting some help from Fiverr, and then I found that ChatGPT could give me similar help. I'm actually using Fiverr less and using ChatGPT more. I find that quite an amazing swap. But having said that, it still can be time consuming even using ChatGPT, and it could be something that you would still use offshore resources to help with.
Okay, so I've used Fiverr once in my life and was very satisfied with the result. They were able to do at the detail level, do something technically that I didn't know how to do, although I could explain it conceptually. And they delivered a quality result, and it was reasonably on budget, and it was very small, and I'm very happy. By bringing ChatGPT into the conversation, you're pointing out how the emergence of this technology is going to dramatically change the world. You just gave a small personal example, and I think those exist for almost every professional. So, for example, getting ChatGPT to do coding for you, yeah, that can make you look amazingly productive. What irritates me is people get so enthralled by it, they don't review the code, which means that there's going to be a bug or a misunderstanding or a misconstruction in there somewhere. You still have an obligation to review and test the code to make sure it really is on target. So I think this AI, generative AI chatbot is going to change the way things work on projects. I love the prospect of building requirements documents with ChatGPT. Often people want to get involved in building things, and writing things down they find as irritating or annoying or unnecessary when it's really crucial to build commonality or consensus on what and how we're actually going to do things. So if building a draft requirements document with ChatGPT gets me halfway there or 3/4 of the way there, and then I use Word to make the corrections, fill in the gaps, and round it out, wow, that's a huge benefit. But to suggest that ChatGPT is going to get me more than half the way there or get me to 90% of the way there, I'm not willing to believe that. Be happy at half. That's huge.
Yep, true. So it can be used for project artifacts to get you started or to bring together a whole range of maybe emails even and meeting notes to draft a single document, but it might only be 50% of that requirements document. You'll then need to apply your human contribution to bring it up to 100, to bring it up to 90%, and then you socialize it for the remaining 10%.
Exactly. That's the process. And if you think ChatGPT can get you to the point where you're ready to socialize, no, that's unrealistic. And if it's true, I start to wonder, what kind of contribution are you making? Why do I need you if ChatGPT can get me to 90%?
Right. Just before there's so much more to talk about on this topic, but one of the reasons I wanted to raise this was in a project context, and where the project sponsor could have a role is sometimes, well, at the moment, not all organizations, especially not all large organizations, are using these tools everywhere where they could because of security concerns, a whole heap of reasons that the full rollouts haven't been done yet. They're not available to everybody as yet. In some organizations, they are. If you're not using it, why aren't you using it? And it's in a performance review.
You don't have to wait for a rollout. You can just start a personal account right now.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Nobody's going to stop you.
Oh, it's just, sharing commercial information, all that kind of thing.
No, you should be cognizant of that. Hopefully, people have an AI usage policy that addresses that.
Right.
So
yeah.
I've written an article about AI usage policies to consider. What should be in those? I don't know if that's a good topic for a future podcast. But the project sponsor has a role in high-level policy issues like that. And back to the project sponsor needs to be engaged all the way along a project, needs to attend all the steering committee meetings, and needs to help the project manager be successful. So, again, you can look at some of that in our book, A Project Sponsor's Warp Speed Guide. It doesn't take over the life of a project sponsor, but they need to be visible at certain touch points to reduce risk, demonstrate organizational commitment to the project, and help the project manager. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's how you get to quality and on-time delivery.
I know organizations where they have the AI usage policy, but staff weren't adhering to it. The temptation's too great to get those real productivity gains by using it, and so it's blocked. So they can't upload a spreadsheet and even if you can't upload, you could still copy and paste. People can still do that. And So it's just been blocked until
Right.
further assessment. And, you can get enterprise licenses, but it takes time for the organization to vet
Oh,
all the options and then to choose the enterprise license.
yeah.
Once that's done, great, it's all
Well,
available.
I can circumvent all of what you just said by taking my laptop down to Starbucks at the end of the block and do it there. And that creates horrible risks for the organization when people do that. So I think the CIO needs to be the project sponsor of a project to bring a product like ChatGPT or its peers in-house as a priority project. That's my answer to that problem.
Right. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And we need the project sponsor to really take that seriously if their organization hasn't yet adopted an internal version of an internal license.
Yeah. Whatever the strategic plan is, that project probably comes out of nowhere for most organizations, but it needs to ratchet its way very high, 1, 2, or 3 right now. And I don't know how big that can't be too big or complicated. We kind of sort of know how to do that, bringing ChatGPT in-house. Now, I have to be careful. Most projects at the beginning, you say to yourself, how complicated can this be?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's a very dangerous phrase.
Yeah, the assessment process, the security reviews, all that kind of stuff can take time. They'll get there. It's just,
Yeah.
will it be in time for our project? So on the different things we can use these tools for, so requirements documents, you've mentioned that. One thing that we've been using it for is SQL parsing. Like used to be a big deal. Well, it still is. It still has a lot of value to use Python. There's a lot of Python libraries that can parse SQL so that you can work out the lineage. Some really old SQL scripts a lot of organizations have dating back decades. In this way, you can pull out the sources, the actual sources in a nice readable format, the logic in a nice readable format. Actually, some of these AI tools can do that quite well as well and give you more options in how it's formatted. You just tell it how you want it to be formatted. Whereas with a Python script, you've got to code it all. What are some of the other applications you've seen?
Well, okay, we started talking about the requirements document, and I see that as a huge win using generative AI. So on every project, the design document had better be many times thicker, longer, more complicated than the requirements document. So I see an even bigger win getting ChatGPT involved in design. And then coding. You just mentioned the Python libraries. Well, as you are well aware, most custom software development today is not so much coding, but the assembly of various libraries with bits of code in between. And I see a role for ChatGPT, maybe helping you identify an appropriate library for your work. I see a role for ChatGPT in this scenario where you've said, I like this library, but I need about 15% changes for good reasons, hopefully. So I need a custom version of this. So get ChatGPT to make you that revised version, and then you fix it. That should give you an enormous productivity boost right there. So is that enough examples of where it would make a difference? We're kind of running out of time here.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, that's a lot of examples. Just quickly on design though. So what kind of design? Is it, what kind of design documents do you have in mind?
So maybe this shows how old I am, but I make a huge distinction between external design and internal design. So external design is mock-ups of what will the screens look like. Be they on a desktop or on a mobile, what are they going to look like? And you're going to have reports, so what are they going to look like? And you're going to have interface processes they had better leave some kind of audit trail of what they did and didn't do and what errors they ran into as they run. So what does that look like? And you're going to have data visualizations. Well, you need to mock those up too. So first, a very graphic approach. What does this thing look like? And that's the external design, where people say, I hate this data visualization mockup. Great. Tell me more, so we can target it better to your business requirements. And then the internal design focuses on how are you going to make those artifacts that we have visually designed? What is an outline of the code, or what are the data sources involved, and what is the tricky processing rules that are behind the scenes? And then once we've got those artifacts in place, then we can let real software developers take over and we can position them for success.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much, Yogi. Can you send me the AI usage articles you mentioned as well, at least one of them, and I'll put that as a link with this podcast?
Okay, so I'll give you a selection, and you can decide which one's relevant.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Okay, well, we're nearly out of time, so thanks so much, Yogi. It's been fantastic. Really helpful.
Okay, I'm glad it's been a successful hour.
Thanks so much, Yogi.
Okay. Bye-bye, Dan.
See you later.